Welcome to another Top 10. Today we bring you the stories of the deadliest famines in recorded history. Please note, while the Taiping event led to the deaths of 60 million, that number includes those killed in battles directly, so does not make this list. Number 10. Chinese famine of 1333. A period of drought created crop failures early on, and China went through much of its food reserves. When the rains finally returned, it fell into dry, hard ground and couldn't be absorbed. Flash floods destroyed plants and animals in their paths. It is estimated that 6 million people were killed from starvation. Scientists believe that this famine is the cause of the bubonic plague that decimated Europe, as hungry people were eating anything to survive, including unknown plants, strange animals, and the dead, creating new diseases along the way. Number 9. Deccan famine of 1630. Continual crop failure and massive swarms of locusts caused this 1600s famine, which killed about 7.4 million people. Historians believe that while India suffered the most casualties, that parts of Asia were decimated as well, because Asia would normally send relief during disasters like this. Number 8. Great European Famine of 1315. Unlike most of the famines on this list, the Great European Famine was actually caused by too much water. Flooding hit, rains were constant, the sun didn't breach through the clouds, and plants rotted before they would ripen. The straw to feed animals couldn't be cured, and salt, the main way to preserve meat, disintegrated because of the moisture. Royals and wealthy merchants were the only ones with access to food, and prices skyrocketed. Prisoners were fed to other prisoners. People were starving. They began killing and eating their pets and children out of mercy, as they couldn't afford to keep them alive. This famine is the reason for the book Hansel and Gretel. Number 7. Great Bengal Famine of 1770. This famine should scare anyone who knows about current events. Unlike the aforementioned famines, this one was caused by heat, drought, government corruption, corporate greed, price gouging, and a pandemic. Sound familiar? The crops failed in 1768, which wasn't out of the ordinary. But when the rains didn't fall in 69, rural areas sent out messages of distress to the British East India Company, but they were ignored. By the time 1770 hit, India's people were already emaciated and starving. Many were forced to eat others who had died just to survive. Because people were too weak, smallpox, cholera, and malaria spread like wildfire throughout the country. This all could have been prevented though. Prior to colonial rule, India's leaders would waive taxes for farmers and send relief, so there was enough food for the country. But that ended once the colonists took over and corporate greed ensued. Because of the deaths, there were less tax profits coming in, so the East India Company increased the tax of the remaining agricultural sales to 50% of value, so their profits could stay high. Food was monopolized and hoarded, and companies increased their prices to extraordinary levels, knowing that the rich would pay handsomely for the limited food. During this time, they actually doubled their profits, while the impoverished were plagued by starvation, water shortages, and disease. 30 million people suffered, and it's estimated that 10 million were dead by the end, 1/3 of the impacted population. The British put their greed over human lives, and even though the rains returned in 1770, too many rural farmers were dead. To save the profits of the company, they then passed the Tea Act, the reason for America's Boston Tea Party. Number 6. Chalisa Famine of 1780. When the weather and solar phenomenon El Niño happens, ocean temperatures rise, winds shift, and nutrient-dead water flows towards the shores. Fish die en masse, while drought hits and animal and plant disease run rampant. The 1780 El Niño weather caused the Chalisa famine in India. Different rulers' actions led to a lack of humanitarian cooperation, and it's estimated that 11 million people died. Number 5. The Dojibara Skull Famine. This El Niño that hit in 1789 was the first El Niño to be recorded scientifically and helped explain the event that hit India in our number 6 famine. The monsoons failed to fall for 4 straight years. The rich and people in areas ruled by the East India Company were able to get by, but the impoverished rural people were dying so quickly that body disposal couldn't keep up. Bones filled the cities, turning the ground white. A later discovery, an entire road of mass buried skulls, gives this famine the moniker the Skull Famine. It is estimated that 11 million people were killed from starvation or from disease caused by eating rotted or unsafe plants and animals. Number 4. 1876 El Niño Grande Seca famines. In 1876, an El Niño phenomenon caused long periods of drought. Rains essentially ceased across the globe. People were dying in record numbers in China, Brazil, India, and Africa. As the crops died, fish populations plummeted and agricultural disease spread. Lives could have been saved in India, but there were cutbacks and poor management within the colonial humanitarian effort. Missionaries raised millions of dollars in relief for the impacted countries, but it wasn't enough. 5 to 10 million people in India, 9 to 13 million in China, and about 500,000 in Brazil had died before the rains returned in 1879. This is the deadliest disaster in Brazilian history. Number 3. The Great Chinese Famine. This famine was man-made, which makes it even more scary. The Chinese government in 1959 ordered that farms could no longer be privatized, going as far as destroying backyard gardens, and forced more people to work in the mines and industrial industries instead. China then ordered the mass culling of sparrows and rats, but without them, crops were decimated by bugs. Between the shortages of workers and increased pests, food became very scarce. People were dying waiting in line for grain rations. While this event is likely the deadliest, we go by minimum deaths. Only 15 million were reported by the government, but most scientists say between 30 and 55 million people were lost to this famine. Number 2. World War II. I know having a war on here seems a bit strange, but the 11th deadliest famine was caused by the Russian Civil War and the 13th by World War I. Hitler's hunger plan had devastating consequences. Nazis stole farms from nations they thought were inferior and confiscated all food along the way, killing 7 million in their path. The war blocked the trade and exchange of goods, separated cities, put people into concentration camps and ghettos, removed leaders in relief programs, and many farmers were forced to join the military instead of producing food, so produce became scarce. 1.1 million were actually killed from starvation after the war ended because aid was not given to the Germans or the Soviets, and their cities and infrastructures were demolished. In total, between 18 and 24 million were killed from lack of food. We did not include the numbers of those who were killed in extermination camps on this list, because the victims' cause of death are impossible to know. Number 1. The 1907 East Central China Famine. China saw some strange weather in 1906. Heavy rains and storms hit for 3 months without stop and flooded many areas. In September, they were hit by a tsunami that killed 10,000. The floods destroyed farms and crops, and with the poor harvest and coastal cities destroyed, the food reserves quickly depleted. There was violence, riots, and people were so desperate for food they began resorting to cannibalism by digging up recent graves or killing others. It was a dark time, and 25 million people lost their lives. In response, the first government relief effort in China was put into place to save lives in the future. Thank you for joining us. If you know of a famine we missed, please leave it in the comments below. Also, if you have a suggestion for a future top 10, we'd love to hear it. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to the channel and hit the bell icon so you'll be alerted to new videos here on Bad Day HQ.